Would you take a job where your survival depends on following unspoken, terrifying rules? My midnight shift at a remote Texas diner came with a sinister catch. Always leave a pie slice on table 7, and never acknowledge the scratching from the kitchen pantry. Stay tuned, because you won't believe what happened when I broke one of them. My name is Daniel Reeves, and 6 months ago, I was just another broke college dropout looking for any job that would take me. I had burned through my savings faster than I care to admit, and when I saw the faded help wanted sign in the window of a roadside diner somewhere between nowhere and oblivion on Highway 87, I thought fate had finally thrown me a bone. Looking back now, I understand that fate has a twisted sense of humor, and sometimes the bones it throws you belong to something that should have stayed buried. The Lonesome Star Diner sat about 40 miles outside of any town worth mentioning, planted in the middle of a stretch of Texas highway that seemed to exist outside of time itself. The building was an old silver Airstream-style structure, probably built sometime in the 1950s, with a flickering neon sign that buzzed like a dying insect every time the wind picked up. The letters spelled out the name in pale pink light, though the second E in Lonesome had given up the ghost years ago, leaving it to read, Lonesome Star Diner, in a way that felt almost intentional, like a warning I was too desperate to heed. I pulled my beat-up Honda Civic into the gravel parking lot at 11:30 on a Tuesday night in late October. The air was unseasonably cold for Texas, carrying with it the smell of sage and something else I couldn't quite place, something metallic and old. The highway stretched endlessly in both directions, disappearing into darkness that seemed to swallow the weak illumination of my headlights. There were no other cars in the lot, no signs of life except for the warm glow bleeding through the diner's windows and that incessant buzzing of the damaged sign. I remember thinking how peaceful it seemed, how quiet. I had spent the last 3 years of my life in Austin, surrounded by noise and chaos and the constant pressure of trying to be someone I wasn't. This place, this forgotten outpost on the edge of civilization, felt like exactly what I needed. A fresh start. A place where I could disappear for a while and figure out my next move. I had no idea that disappearing was exactly what this place had in mind for me, just not in the way I had hoped. The door creaked when I pushed it open, announcing my arrival to the empty booths and silent counter stools. The interior matched the exterior perfectly, a time capsule from an era when diners were the beating hearts of American road culture. Red vinyl seats lined the booths along the windows, their surfaces cracked and faded, but meticulously clean. A long counter stretched the length of the building, topped with speckled formica and lined with chrome stools that had probably supported the weight of 1,000 weary travelers over the decades. The air smelled like old coffee and something sweet, maybe apple pie, though there was an undercurrent of something less pleasant lurking beneath the surface. Mildew, perhaps, or age, or something I couldn't yet identify. I counted the tables as I walked toward the counter. There were exactly 7 of them, not including the booths. Each one was identical, topped with the same red and white checkered tablecloths, and the same salt and pepper shakers, and the same little metal holders containing sugar packets and artificial sweetener. But my eyes kept drifting to table 7, the one positioned in the corner furthest from the door. Something about it felt different, though I couldn't explain why. It was just a table, just like all the others. And yet, I felt an inexplicable urge to look away from it, like my subconscious was trying to protect me from something my conscious mind couldn't yet perceive. That should have been my first warning. The kitchen doors swung open, and I met the man who would become the architect of my nightmares. His name was Vernon Hoyt, and he was the sole owner and operator of the Lonesome Star Diner. He was tall and thin, with the kind of leathery skin that comes from decades of Texas sun, and eyes so pale they were almost colorless. He moved with a deliberate slowness, each step calculated and precise. And when he finally reached the counter where I stood, he simply stared at me without speaking. The silence stretched between us like a living thing, uncomfortable and heavy. I cleared my throat and introduced myself, explaining that I'd seen the help wanted sign and was looking for work. Vernon continued to stare, his expression unreadable, and for a long moment, I was convinced he was going to tell me to leave. I almost wished he had. "Night shift," he said finally, his voice like gravel being ground under a boot heel. "Midnight to 6. You work alone." I nodded, perhaps too eagerly. The isolation didn't bother me, or at least that's what I told myself. I had always preferred solitude, always felt more comfortable in my own company than in the chaos of crowds. Vernon must have seen something in my face, some desperate hunger that made me the perfect candidate for whatever he needed, because his thin lips curled into something that might have been a smile, but felt more like a grimace. "You start tomorrow," he said. "Be here at 11:30. Don't be late." And that was it. No interview, no application, no questions about my experience or my references or anything that a normal employer might want to know. He simply handed me a set of keys and a faded apron, and then he disappeared back through the kitchen doors without another word. I stood there for several minutes, holding those keys like they were the most precious things in the world, completely unaware of the weight they truly carried. The next night, I arrived at exactly 11:30, just as Vernon had instructed. He was waiting for me behind the counter, already wearing his coat and hat, clearly eager to leave. The diner was empty, which didn't surprise me given its remote location, and the only sound was the hum of the refrigerated display case and the distant rumble of the occasional truck passing on the highway. Vernon showed me the basics with the same economy of words he had displayed the night before. The coffee machine, the pie case, the location of the cleaning supplies, and the emergency numbers taped to the wall beside the ancient rotary phone. He moved through the diner with practiced efficiency, pointing and grunting, never offering more explanation than was absolutely necessary. It was during this tour that I first noticed the door. It was at the back of the kitchen, partially hidden behind a stack of supply crates. Unlike the other doors in the diner, which were standard industrial models with small windows and push bars, this one was solid wood, heavy and old, with a padlock the size of my fist securing it shut. The wood around the frame was darker than the rest, stained with something that might have been water damage or might have been something else entirely. I pointed at it and asked what was inside. Vernon's reaction was immediate and unsettling. He stopped mid-sentence, his pale eyes snapping to mine with an intensity that made my blood run cold. For a moment, something flickered in those colorless depths, something that looked very much like fear, and then it was gone, replaced by a carefully constructed mask of indifference. "Storage," he said, his voice flat and final. "You don't go in there. Ever." I wanted to ask why. I wanted to press him for more information, to understand the reason behind the sudden tension that had filled the kitchen like smoke. But something in his expression told me that questions would not be tolerated, that some lines were not meant to be crossed. So I simply nodded and followed him back to the front of the diner, pretending I hadn't seen the way his hands trembled slightly as he moved past that locked door. Before he left, Vernon paused at the entrance and turned back to face me. The neon light from the sign outside cast strange shadows across his features, making him look older and somehow less human than he had appeared just moments before. "There are rules," he said, and something in his tone made the hair on the back of my neck stand at attention. "Some of them I'll tell you. Some of them you'll have to figure out on your own. But whatever happens, whatever you see or hear, you follow the rules. You understand me?" I nodded again, though I didn't understand at all. How could I? I was still operating under the naive assumption that this was just another dead-end job, just another stop on the long road of my aimless existence. I had no idea that the rules Vernon spoke of were not the mundane guidelines of food service, but rather a complex system of survival that had been refined over decades, written in the blood and tears of those who had come before me. Vernon studied my face for a long moment, as if searching for something he wasn't sure he would find. Then he grunted, pulled his hat low over his eyes, and disappeared into the night. I watched his truck rumble to life and pull out of the parking lot, its taillights fading into the darkness like dying stars. And then I was alone. Truly, completely alone. Just me and the empty diner and the endless Texas night stretching out in all directions. I spent the first hour of my shift exploring my new workplace, familiarizing myself with every corner and crevice. The diner was small enough that this didn't take long, and soon I found myself sitting behind the counter with a cup of coffee, watching the highway through the windows and wondering if anyone would actually come in. The clock on the wall ticked away the seconds with mechanical indifference, and the silence began to press in around me like a physical weight. It was around 1 a.m. when I first heard it. A faint sound, so quiet I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. A scratching, soft and rhythmic, coming from somewhere deep in the kitchen. I set down my coffee and listened, my heart beginning to beat just a little faster. The sound continued, persistent and oddly deliberate, like fingernails being dragged across wood, and it was coming from the direction of that locked pantry door. I stood up and took a step toward the kitchen, then stopped. Vernon's words echoed in my mind, cold and certain. "You don't go in there. Ever." I told myself it was probably just mice, just some ordinary explanation for an ordinary sound. But deep down, in that primal part of my brain that still remembered what it meant to be prey, I knew that explanation was a lie. Whatever was making that sound, it wasn't mice. And whatever was behind that door, it wasn't storage. The scratching stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The silence that followed was somehow worse, heavy with anticipation and unspoken threat. I stood frozen in the middle of the diner, my coffee growing cold on the counter behind me, and I waited for something to happen. Nothing did. At least, not that night. But as I would soon discover, that was just the beginning. The Lonesome Star Diner had secrets older than the highway it sat upon, and I had just signed up to be their newest keeper. The scratching was merely an introduction, a whispered preview of horrors yet to come. 3 nights into my employment at the Lonesome Star Diner, I had settled into what I believed was a comfortable routine. I would arrive at 11:30, receive a curt nod from Vernon as he handed over the keys, and then spend the next 6 hours in relative solitude, serving the occasional late-night traveler who wandered in from the highway. The scratching from the pantry had become background noise, something I had trained myself to ignore even as every instinct screamed at me to investigate. I was learning to live with the unexplained, to accept the strange rhythms of this place without question. But that third night changed everything. It started around 2 a.m, during that dead hour when the world seems to hold its breath between night and dawn. I was wiping down the counter for perhaps the 5th time, more out of boredom than necessity, when headlights swept across the windows and a semi-truck rumbled into the parking lot. The engine idled for a long moment before shutting off, and I watched as a figure climbed down from the cab and made its way toward the entrance. The trucker who walked through the door was unremarkable in almost every way. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing the standard uniform of his profession, worn jeans, a flannel shirt, and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He moved with a strange, deliberate grace, each step perfectly measured, and when he took his seat at the counter, he did so without making a single sound. No squeak of the stool, no rustle of clothing, nothing. He simply appeared on the seat, as if he had always been there. I approached him with a smile that felt more forced than I would have liked, and asked what I could get him. The trucker didn't respond. He sat perfectly still, his hands folded on the counter in front of him, his face hidden beneath the shadow of his cap. I tried again, louder this time, wondering if perhaps he was hard of hearing. Still nothing. Just that eerie stillness, that complete and utter silence. And then I made my first mistake. Without thinking, I leaned forward, trying to catch a glimpse of his face beneath the brim of his hat. I wanted to see his eyes, to make contact with something human, something that would explain this strange behavior. My head dipped low, My gaze angled upward, and for just a fraction of a second, I saw him. What I saw was wrong. His eyes were too large, far too large for a human skull, and they held no color at all. They were simply black, endless and empty, like windows into a void that should not exist. His mouth was curved into a smile, but it stretched too wide, far beyond what any jaw should allow, revealing teeth that were too numerous and too sharp. And his skin, what I could see of it, had a quality that reminded me of wax left too long in the sun, smooth and slightly melted, as if the face I was looking at was merely a mask attempting to approximate humanity without truly understanding what it was copying. I jerked back so violently that I knocked over a glass of water on the counter behind me. The crash seemed impossibly loud in the silence of the diner, and for a terrible moment, I was convinced the trucker would react, would rise from his seat and reveal whatever horror lurked beneath that flannel shirt. But he remained still, perfectly, impossibly still, as if nothing had happened at all. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, and my hands shook as I grabbed a towel to mop up the spilled water. I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the counter, refusing to look at the trucker again, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run. But I didn't. I couldn't. Something held me in place, some instinct that whispered running would only make things worse. 20 minutes passed, then 30. The trucker sat without moving, without ordering, without making a single sound. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. I didn't see him leave. One moment he was there, and the next, the stool was empty. I heard the rumble of the truck engine starting, saw the headlights sweep across the windows as the vehicle pulled back onto the highway, and then the night was quiet once again. I spent the rest of that shift in a state of barely controlled panic. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow seemed to hide something terrible. When Vernon arrived at 6 to relieve me, I nearly collapsed with relief. He took one look at my face, and something flickered in those pale eyes of his, something that might have been recognition. "You saw him," Vernon said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, unable to form words. Vernon sighed heavily and leaned against the counter, suddenly looking older and more tired than I had ever seen him. He was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with resignation. "He comes 3 or 4 times a week," Vernon said, "always between 2 and 4 in the morning. He never orders anything. He never speaks. And you never, ever look at his face." I wanted to ask why. I wanted to demand explanations, to understand what I had seen and what it meant. But Vernon's expression made it clear that no explanation would be forthcoming. This was simply the way things were. The trucker came. You didn't look at him. And if you were smart, you pretended he wasn't there at all. What happens if you look at him? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Vernon's jaw tightened. The last person who asked me that question ain't around anymore to tell you. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Over the next few nights, I'll learn more rules. Some were given to me directly by Vernon, delivered in his characteristic terse manner. Others I had to piece together on my own, through observation and careful deduction. Each one seemed more inexplicable than the last, and each one carried the same unspoken weight, the same sense that breaking them would result in consequences too terrible to contemplate. The pie was the second rule I learned, and in many ways, it was the strangest. Every night, without fail, Vernon would cut a single slice of apple pie and place it on table 7 before leaving. The table was always empty, always clean, and the pie would sit there throughout my entire shift, untouched and waiting. I was instructed never to move it, never to eat it, and never to clear it away, no matter what happened. When I asked who it was for, Vernon simply shook his head and told me that some questions were better left unasked. I watched that pie slice for hours during my shifts, convinced that someone, something, would eventually come claim it. But no one ever did. The pie would sit on the table, growing stale and cold, and when Vernon arrived in the morning, he would quietly dispose of it and cut a fresh slice for the following night. It was a ritual, a tribute, and though I didn't understand its purpose, I knew instinctively that it was important. One night, about a week into my employment, I decided to conduct a small experiment. I positioned myself at the counter with a clear view of table 7 and resolved to watch the pie for my entire shift. If something came for it, I would see it. I would finally have answers. The hours crawled by. 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3. The trucker came and went, and I kept my eyes firmly fixed on the counter as he sat in his usual spot. The scratching from the pantry ebbed and flowed in its familiar rhythm, and table 7 remained empty. Around 4 in the morning, I felt my eyelids growing heavy. The warm, quiet atmosphere of the diner was lulling me towards sleep, and despite my best efforts, I found myself nodding off. It was only for a moment, perhaps 30 seconds at most. But when I opened my eyes again, the pie was gone. I shot to my feet, my heart racing. The table was exactly as it had been before, the checkered tablecloth perfectly arranged, the salt and pepper shakers in their proper positions. But the plate was empty, not just missing, but licked clean, as if whoever had eaten the pie had been desperate to consume every last crumb. And that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the fork. It was still there, resting on the edge of the plate, positioned at an angle that suggested it had been set down carefully, deliberately. And on the handle of the fork, clearly visible in the dim light of the diner, was a single fingerprint. But it wasn't made of oil or grease or any of the normal substances that human fingers leave behind. It was made of something dark and thick, something that looked very much like dried blood. I didn't touch the plate. I didn't go anywhere near table 7 for the rest of that shift. When Vernon arrived in the morning, he glanced at the empty plate and nodded slowly, as if this was exactly what he had expected. He cleaned it without comment, set out a fresh slice, and went about his morning routine as if nothing unusual had occurred. "Who eats it?" I finally asked, unable to contain my curiosity any longer. Vernon paused in his work and fixed me with those colorless eyes. "Doesn't matter. I need to know what I'm dealing with here." For a long moment, I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he sighed and leaned against the counter, his expression weary and old. "Her name was Eliza," he said quietly. "She was a waitress here, back in 1952. Young girl, barely 19. One night, she was working alone, and something happened. Nobody knows exactly what. By the time the morning shift arrived, she was gone. All they found was her apron, folded neat on table 7, and a half-eaten slice of pie." He fell silent, lost in memories of events that had occurred decades before I was born. "They never found her body," he continued. "But folks around here say she never really left. They say she's still here, still waiting for someone to acknowledge her, to remember that she existed. The pie is for her. It's the only thing that keeps her quiet." I wanted to dismiss his story as superstition, as the ramblings of an old man who had spent too many years in this isolated place. But I couldn't. I had seen too much already, experienced too many things that defied rational explanation. The trucker with his impossible face, the scratching from behind the locked door, the pie that vanished without a trace. This diner was haunted, not by ghosts in the traditional sense, but by something older and stranger, something that operated according to rules I was only beginning to understand. And if I wanted to survive my time here, I would have to learn those rules quickly. The trucker came again that night, and I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the counter. The scratching continued from the pantry, and I pretended not to hear it. And when 4 in the morning rolled around, I closed my eyes for exactly 30 seconds, giving Eliza the privacy she needed to claim her offering. When I opened them again, the pie was gone, and the fork rested on the empty plate, positioned just so. I was beginning to understand the language of this place, the silent negotiations that occurred every night between the living and whatever else called the Lonesome Star diner home. But understanding was not the same as acceptance. And as the days wore on, my curiosity continued to grow, pushing me closer and closer to the one line I'd been told never to cross. The pantry door beckoned, its secrets whispering to me through the walls. And soon, very soon, I would discover exactly what had been hiding all along. By my third week at the Lonesome Star Diner, I had developed a carefully calibrated system for surviving my shifts. I knew when to avert my eyes, when to close them entirely, and when to pretend that certain sounds simply did not exist. The trucker came and went without incident. The pie disappeared each night, consumed by invisible hands that I had learned not to question. And the scratching from the pantry continued, persistent and rhythmic, like a heartbeat buried deep within the walls of the kitchen. But the scratching was different from the other strange occurrences. The trucker, unsettling as he was, kept to himself. Eliza accepted her nightly offering and remained silent. These were transactions, agreements between worlds that existed in an uneasy truce. But the scratching felt different. It felt desperate. It felt hungry. And no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, it burrowed into my consciousness like a splinter, demanding attention I knew I shouldn't give. The sound always started around midnight, just as Vernon's truck disappeared down the highway and I was left alone with the diner and its inhabitants. It began softly, barely audible over the hum of the refrigerators and the distant rumble of passing trucks. But as the night wore on, it grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever made that sound knew I was listening and was trying to communicate through the only means available to it. I tried to rationalize it. Mice, I told myself. Rats. The settling of old wood in the cold Texas nights. But deep down, I knew these explanations were lies. The scratching was too deliberate, too purposeful. It followed patterns that no animal could produce. Sometimes it came in sequences of 3, sometimes in 5, and sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, it would stop entirely, replaced by a silence so profound it felt like the world was holding its breath. Those moments of silence were the worst, because in those moments, I could hear something else, something that sounded very much like breathing. I asked Vernon about the pantry again during one of our brief handoff conversations. He was even more curt than usual, his face closing down like a door slamming shut. "There's nothing in there that concerns you," he said, his voice flat and final. "You leave that door alone. You hear me? No matter what you think you hear, no matter what it sounds like, you leave it alone." The intensity of his response only made my curiosity worse. I found myself spending more and more time near the kitchen, finding excuses to be closer to that locked door. I would stand at the industrial sink, washing dishes that didn't need washing, straining my ears to catch every nuance of the sounds that emanated from behind that ancient wood. And the scratching continued, night after night, as reliable as the sunrise that would eventually release me from my vigil. 3 weeks into my employment, something changed. It was a Thursday night, unremarkable in every way except for the storm that had rolled in from the west. Lightning flickered on the horizon, and thunder growled in the distance, adding a new layer of sound to the usual nocturnal symphony. The diner felt different during storms, more isolated, more removed from the world of logic and reason. The neon sign outside buzzed and flickered with each flash of lightning, casting strange shadows across the empty booths and silent tables. I was cleaning the coffee machine when I heard it. Not scratching this time, but something else. A voice, soft and pleading, barely audible above the distant thunder. It was coming from the pantry. "Help me." I froze, my hand still wrapped around the coffee pot, every muscle in my body rigid with sudden terror. I had expected many things from behind that door. Growls, perhaps. Inhuman sounds that would confirm my darkest suspicions. But not a voice. Not words. Not something so undeniably human. "Please, help me." The voice was female, young, and utterly broken. It cracked on the last word, dissolving into a sob that tore at something deep in my chest. Every instinct told me to run, to get as far away from that door as possible. But I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, caught between fear and an overwhelming desire to help whoever, whatever, was making that sound. "You locked me in here." The voice continued, stronger now. "So long ago. Please let me out. I just want to go home." My feet began to move without my conscious permission, carrying me toward the kitchen and that terrible door. The scratching had started again, more frantic than before, and I could see the wood bulging slightly with each impact, as if something was throwing itself against the barrier with desperate force. I reached the door and stood before it, my hand hovering inches from the padlock. The metal was old and rusted, and I knew instinctively that the key was somewhere in the diner, probably hidden away in one of Vernon's many secret places. I could find it if I looked. I could end this mystery once and for all. "Please," the voice sobbed. "I can hear you out there. I know you're there. Just let me out. I've been so alone." My fingers touched the padlock, and something cold shot through my entire body. It was like plunging my hand into ice water, a shock so profound that it drove the air from my lungs. And in that moment, I saw something, not with my eyes, but with something deeper, something primal. I saw a face pressed against the other side of the door, just inches from where I stood. And the face was not human. It might have been once. There were the basic elements still present: eyes, nose, mouth. But they had been twisted, distorted, stretched into configurations that no human face should ever assume. The eyes were too wide, filled with a hunger that went beyond physical need. The mouth gaped open, revealing a darkness inside that seemed to extend forever, a void where throat and lungs should have been. And the skin, oh God, the skin, it was gray and mottled, hanging in loose folds, as if whatever wore it had been dead for a very long time, but had somehow forgotten to stop moving. I jerked my hand back and stumbled away from the door, crashing into the supply crates and sending them toppling across the kitchen floor. The voice from behind the door changed then, shifting from pleading to something else entirely. Laughter, high and cold and utterly devoid of humanity. So close, it whispered, and now there was no pretense of humanity in the sound. It was wet and slithering, like something being dragged through mud. "You almost opened the door. Almost let me out. But there's time. There's so much time." The scratching resumed, louder and more violent than ever before, and I ran. I ran from the kitchen, through the diner, and out into the parking lot, where the storm had finally arrived in full force. Rain lashed my face and soaked my clothes, but I didn't care. I stood in the middle of the gravel lot, gasping for breath, staring at the diner through the sheets of falling water. Lightning flashed, illuminating the building in stark white light. And for just a moment, I saw something in the kitchen window, a shape barely visible through the glass. It was watching me, waiting, smiling. I couldn't go back inside. Not that night. I sat in my car until dawn, watching the diner, listening to the storm rage around me. When Vernon's truck finally appeared on the highway, I was still shaking, still unable to process what I had experienced. Vernon took one look at my face and sighed heavily. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't need to. "You touched the door," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, unable to speak. Vernon was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes studying me with something that might have been pity. Then he turned and walked toward the diner, gesturing for me to follow. "I suppose you've earned the right to know," he said. "But I'm warning you, boy. Some knowledge comes with a price. And once you know, you can't unknow. You sure you want that?" I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure of anything anymore. But I followed him anyway, drawn by a need to understand that was stronger than my fear. We entered the diner together, and Vernon led me to a booth near the back, as far from the kitchen as possible. He sat down heavily and pulled a pack of cigarettes from his pocket, lighting one with hands that trembled slightly. Her name was Martha Caldwell. Vernon began, exhaling a cloud of smoke that hung in the air like a ghost. She came to work here in 1967, same as you. Young, desperate, willing to take any job that would have her. She worked a night shift for 3 months without incident, followed the rules, kept her head down, didn't ask too many questions. He paused, taking another long drag on a cigarette. But Martha was curious, too curious for her own good. She wanted to know what was behind that door. Thought maybe it was some kind of elaborate joke, some hazing ritual for new employees. One night, she found a key and opened it. What happened? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Vernon's face darkened. Nobody knows exactly. By the time the morning shift arrived, Martha was gone, but the door was open, and whatever had been inside was gone too. For a while, we thought that was the end of it. Thought maybe Martha had released it and had moved on. He shook his head slowly, stubbing out his cigarette in the ashtray on the table. We were wrong. A week later, Martha came back. At least, something wearing Martha's face came back. It walked into the diner during the night shift, smiled at the girl who was working, and walked straight into the pantry. The door closed behind it, and when we tried to open it, we found the lock had been broken from the inside. We had to install a new one, a stronger one. But if she went back in, I said slowly, why does she keep trying to get out? Vernon fixed me with those colorless eyes, and for the first time, I saw something in them that looked very much like fear. Because that's not Martha anymore, he said. That's the thing that ate Martha, and it learned from her. Learned how to sound human, how to appeal to human sympathy. It uses her voice, her memories, anything it absorbed when it consumed her. And every night, it tries to find someone foolish enough to open that door and let it finish what it started. The scratching started again, faint but persistent, drifting from the kitchen like a heartbeat. Why don't you just destroy it? I asked. Burn the building down, salt the earth, whatever it takes. Vernon laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. You think we haven't tried? That thing has been here longer than the diner, longer than the highway, longer than anything. It was here when the first settlers came through. It'll be here long after we're gone. The best we can do is keep it contained, keep feeding it little pieces of hope so it doesn't get desperate enough to break down the door on its own. I understood then. The rules, the rituals, the constant vigilance. It was all about containment, about maintaining a balance between the thing in the pantry and the world outside. And I was now a part of that balance, whether I liked it or not. The trucker, I said suddenly. The pie for Eliza. Are they part of this too? Part of keeping that thing locked away? Vernon nodded slowly. Everything in this diner serves a purpose. The trucker watches the roads, makes sure nothing tries to come in from outside. Eliza guards the tables, keeps the customers safe while they're under this roof. And the thing in the pantry, well, it keeps everything else in check. They're all connected, all part of a system that's been running since before I was born. You break one link, the whole chain falls apart. I sat in silence, trying to absorb the enormity of what I had just learned. I was not just a night shift worker at a roadside diner. I was a guardian, a gatekeeper, a small but crucial cog in a machine that held back horrors I couldn't begin to comprehend. So what happens now? I asked. Vernon stood up and walked toward the door, pausing with his hand on the frame. Now you make a choice, he said. You can walk away, forget everything you've seen and heard, and never come back. Or you can stay and learn the rest of the rules. Either way, you don't talk about this to anyone. Ever. He left without waiting for an answer, and I sat alone in the empty diner, listening to the scratching from the kitchen and wondering what other secrets this place still held. I didn't leave that night, and I haven't left since. Because the truth is, now that I know what's out there, now that I understand what lurks in the shadows of this forgotten stretch of Texas highway, I can't pretend it doesn't exist. Someone has to stand guard. Someone has to follow the rules. And God help anyone who breaks them. A month had passed since Vernon told me the truth about the Lonesome Star Diner, and I had settled into my role as reluctant guardian with something approaching acceptance. I knew the rules now, understood their purpose, and followed them with religious devotion. The trucker came and went without acknowledgement. The pie disappeared from table 7 every night, and the scratching from the pantry continued, persistent and patient, a constant reminder of the thing that waited just beyond that locked door. But knowledge is a dangerous thing. The more I understood about the mechanics of this place, the more questions arose. Why did the trucker exist? What had happened to Eliza that bound her spirit to these walls? And most troubling of all, what would happen if the rules were broken? Vernon had hinted at consequences, at dark fates that had befallen those who strayed from the established protocols. But he had never been specific. And in the absence of specifics, my imagination filled in the blanks with terrors that kept me awake long after my shifts had ended. The night everything changed started like any other. I arrived at 11:30, received the keys from Vernon, and settled into my familiar routine. The diner was empty, as it usually was at the start of my shift, and the only sounds were the hum of the equipment and the faint scratching from the kitchen. I poured myself a cup of coffee and took my position behind the counter, watching the highway through the windows and waiting for the first customer of the night. He arrived just after 1 a.m, a young man in his early 20s with tired eyes and a travel-worn expression. He slid into one of the booths near the window and ordered a burger and fries, barely glancing at me as he handed over the menu. I put in the order and went about my business, grateful for the brief distraction from the monotony of the night. The food was ready in 15 minutes, and I carried it over to his table with a smile that felt almost genuine. But as I set down the plate, the young man looked up at me, and something in his expression made me pause. "Weird place," he said, glancing around the empty diner. "Don't you get lonely out here?" I shrugged. "You get used to it, I guess." He picked up a French fry and examined it thoughtfully. "I saw a sign for this place about 20 miles back. Figured I'd stop for a bite before finishing the drive to El Paso. Long way from anywhere, isn't it?" I nodded, uncertain where this conversation was heading. "You know what's funny?" the young man continued. "I could swear I've been here before, but that's impossible. I've never driven this route in my life." He laughed, but there was an edge to it, a thread of unease that told me he wasn't entirely joking. Before I could respond, the door opened, and the trucker walked in. I felt him before I saw him, a sudden drop in temperature that made the hair on my arms stand at attention. The young man in the booth stiffened, his eyes widening slightly as the trucker passed, and I knew instinctively that he could sense something was wrong, even if he didn't understand what. The trucker took his usual seat at the counter, and I retreated to my position behind the register, keeping my eyes firmly fixed on the coffee machine. But the young man didn't know the rules. He had no way of knowing that looking at the trucker was forbidden, and as I watched from the corner of my eye, I saw him turn in his seat, curiosity overriding caution, and stare directly at the figure at the counter. "Hey," the young man called out. "Long drive tonight?" The trucker didn't respond. He sat perfectly still, his hands folded in front of him, his face hidden beneath the brim of his cap. But something shifted in the air, a subtle change in pressure that made my ears pop. "Hello." The young man tried again, louder this time. "You okay, buddy?" I opened my mouth to warn him, to tell him to look away, to explain that some things were better left unacknowledged. But it was too late. The young man stood up from his booth and walked toward the counter, reaching out as if to tap the trucker on the shoulder. "Don't," I shouted, but the word came out strangled, barely a whisper. The young man's hand made contact with the trucker's shoulder, and everything went wrong. The lights flickered once, twice, and then died entirely, plunging the diner into absolute darkness. The young man screamed, a high, terrified sound that cut off abruptly, as if someone had pressed a mute button on his voice. I heard something wet and tearing, followed by a thud that shook the floor beneath my feet. Then silence, complete and utter silence. I don't know how long I stood there in the darkness. It felt like hours, but it could have been seconds. When the lights finally flickered back on, the trucker was gone. The stool where he had been sitting was empty, as if he had never been there at all. But the young man was still there, or what was left of him. He was standing in the middle of the diner, exactly where he had been when the lights went out. But he wasn't moving. He wasn't breathing. His eyes were open and staring, fixed on something I couldn't see, and his mouth was stretched wide in a silent scream that seemed to go on forever. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, waxy and wrong, and as I watched, unable to look away, I saw something move beneath the surface, something that squirmed and writhed, pushing against his flesh from the inside. Then he collapsed. His body crumpled to the floor like a puppet with its strings cut, and he lay there, motionless, staring at the ceiling with those empty, awful eyes. I wanted to help him. I wanted to call for an ambulance, to do something, anything, to fix what had happened. But some part of me understood that it was already too late. Whatever the trucker had done to him, whatever had been transferred in that moment of contact, it was beyond the reach of modern medicine. I cleaned up the body. I don't remember doing it, but I must have, because by the time Vernon arrived at 6 a.m, there was no trace of the young man. No blood on the floor. No sign of struggle. Just an empty diner and a half-eaten burger growing cold in one of the booths. Vernon looked at the burger, then looked at me, and I saw understanding dawn in his pale eyes. "Someone touched him," Vernon said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, unable to speak. Vernon sighed heavily and sat down at the counter, suddenly looking older than I had ever seen him. He was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with resignation. "It's been a long time since anyone broke that rule," he said. "I hoped maybe it wouldn't happen again, but I suppose that was foolish." "What is he?" I asked. "The trucker. What is he really?" Vernon considered the question carefully before answering. "He's a collector," he said finally. "Has been since before this diner was built, before the highway, before any of it. He drives the roads at night, looking for souls that have wandered too far from the light. The desperate, the lost, the ones no one will miss. He collects them and takes them somewhere else. Where? I don't know. And frankly, I don't want to know." Vernon stood up and walked toward the kitchen, pausing at the door. "The rules exist for a reason, boy. Not just to protect you, but to protect everyone who comes through these doors. The trucker doesn't hunt. He waits. As long as you don't acknowledge him, as long as you don't make contact, he'll leave you alone. But the moment you cross that line, you become fair game." I thought about the young man, about his tired eyes and his innocent curiosity. He had just wanted to be friendly, to make conversation with a fellow traveler on a lonely road. And that simple, human impulse had cost him everything. "What happens to the ones he takes?" I asked. Vernon paused, his hand on the kitchen door, and for a moment, I saw something flicker in his eyes. Fear, perhaps, or pity, or maybe just the weight of too many years spent keeping secrets that no one should have to carry. "They drive with him," Vernon said quietly. "Forever. There are stories, old stories from before my time, about travelers who claim to see the trucker's rig on the highway. They said if you looked close, you could see faces in the windows of his cab. Dozens of them. Hundreds. All pressed against the glass, watching the road ahead." He pushed through the kitchen door and disappeared, leaving me alone with the empty diner and the weight of what I had just learned. The scratching from the pantry seemed louder that morning, more insistent, as if the thing behind the door knew what had happened, knew that the balance had been disrupted. I sat at the counter and stared at nothing, trying to process the horror I had witnessed and the knowledge that I was now complicit in its concealment. But even as I sat there, lost in guilt and confusion, a new feeling began to take root. Anger. I was angry at Vernon for keeping secrets, at the diner for trapping me in this nightmare, at the rules themselves for being so arbitrary and cruel. The young man had done nothing wrong. He had simply been human, curious and friendly, and for that he had paid the ultimate price. It wasn't fair. None of this was fair. And in that moment of anger, something dangerous flickered to life inside me. A desire to understand, to challenge, to push back against the forces that had turned my life into a waking nightmare. I knew I should ignore it, should bury it deep and continue following the rules like a good little guardian. But the young man's face haunted me, his eyes staring into nothing, his mouth frozen in that eternal scream. Someone had to do something. Someone had to find out what these rules really meant and why they existed. And if Vernon wouldn't tell me, I would find out on my own. The scratching from the pantry intensified, as if whatever lurked behind that door could sense my rebellion, could taste the defiance rising in my blood. I ignored it, for now, but the boundaries had been tested, and I knew that more tests were coming. The question was no longer whether I would break the rules, but when. And when that moment came, I could only hope that I was ready for whatever came next. The final night of my employment at the Lonesome Star Diner began like any other. I arrived at 11:30, received the keys from Vernon, and took my position behind the counter with a cup of coffee that I knew I wouldn't finish. The neon sign buzzed outside, casting its pale pink glow across the gravel parking lot. The highway stretched endlessly in both directions, a ribbon of darkness connecting nowhere to nothing. And somewhere deep in the kitchen, the scratching continued, patient and eternal. But this night was different. I could feel it in my bones. In a way, the air seemed heavier than usual, charged with an electricity that had nothing to do with the weather. Something was coming. Something was about to change. And for the first time since I had started working at this godforsaken place, I wasn't afraid. I was ready. The trucker came at his usual time, around 2 a.m. I kept my eyes fixed on the counter as he took his seat, carefully avoiding any acknowledgement of his presence. But tonight, even as I followed the rules, I studied him from the corner of my eye. I watched the way he sat, perfectly still, perfectly silent. I watched the shadows that gathered around him, deeper and darker than they should have been. And I watched the slight tilt of his head, as if he knew I was looking, as if he was waiting for me to slip up. But I didn't. Not yet. Around 3:30, I walked to the pie case and cut a fresh slice, carrying it carefully to table 7 and placing it in its designated spot. The ritual was automatic by now, ingrained so deeply that I could have performed in my sleep. But as I set down the plate, I paused. Something was different tonight. The air around table 7 felt colder, thicker, and when I looked at the empty chair across from me, I could have sworn I saw something sitting there. A shape, barely visible, flickering like a candle flame in a draft. "Eliza," I whispered. The shape flickered again, and for just a moment, I saw her. A young woman with dark hair and sad eyes, wearing a waitress uniform that had gone out of style decades ago. She was looking at me, really looking, and her lips moved as if she was trying to say something. Then she was gone, and the chair was empty once more. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the spot where she had been. In all my weeks at the diner, I had never seen Eliza. I had felt her presence, had known she was there in the same way you know the sun will rise in the morning. But she had never shown herself, never made contact. Until now. Something was definitely happening tonight. The rules were shifting, the boundaries blurring. And I knew, with a certainty that went beyond logic, that I needed to be ready for whatever came next. The trucker left around 4:30, disappearing without a sound, and I was alone once more. The scratching from the pantry had grown louder over the past hour, more frantic, and I found myself walking toward the kitchen without consciously deciding to do so. I stopped in front of the locked door and placed my hand against the wood, feeling the vibrations of whatever was happening on the other side. "I know you're there," I said quietly, "and I know what you are." The scratching stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Then the voice came, Martha's voice, soft and pleading. "Please," it said, "I've been so lonely. Just open the door. Just let me see you." But I could hear something beneath the words now, something I hadn't noticed before. A second voice, layered beneath the first, speaking in a language that no human tongue could produce. It was hungry and cold and utterly inhuman, and it dripped with anticipation. "No," I said. "I know what you did to Martha. I know what you are. And I know you've been waiting for someone to let you out." The silence stretched on, and I wondered if I had finally silenced the thing for good. Then it laughed, that same cold, wet sound I had heard before, and the door shuddered in its frame. "Clever little mortal," it said, and all pretense of humanity was gone. "You think you understand? You think you know what lurks in the dark places of this world? I have been here since before your species crawled out of the mud. I have watched civilizations rise and fall. I have fed on the fear and desperation of countless souls. And I am patient. So very, very patient. But you can't get out," I said. "You've been behind that door for decades, and you're still trapped." "For now," it agreed. "But doors open, little mortal. Locks break. And eventually, someone always lets me out. They can't help themselves. Your kind is so curious, so eager to peek behind a curtain. It's only a matter of time." I stood there in the darkness of the kitchen, listening to the thing behind the door, and I felt something shift inside me. Not fear, not anymore. Something harder, colder. Determination. "Not tonight," I said. "And not ever, as long as I'm here." The thing laughed again, but there was something different in the sound now. Frustration, perhaps, or surprise. "We'll see," it whispered. "We'll see." I turned and walked back to the front of the diner, and the scratching resumed, softer now, almost subdued. The first gray light of dawn was beginning to seep over the horizon, painting the highway in shades of pink and gold. I stood at the windows and watched the sun rise, feeling its warmth on my face, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something like peace. Vernon arrived at 6 on the dot, as he always did. He took one look at my face and paused, his pale eyes studying me with an intensity one had not seen before. "Something happened," he said. I nodded. I talked to it, the thing in the pantry, and I saw Eliza. Vernon was quiet for a long moment. Then he walked to the counter and poured himself a cup of coffee, his movements slow and deliberate. "Most people who see Eliza don't last long," he said finally. "She only shows herself when she knows something's coming. She's a warning of sorts." "A warning of what?" Vernon took a long sip of his coffee, staring out the window at the brightening sky. "The balance is shifting," he said. "It happens every few decades. The forces in this place, the things we keep contained, they start pushing against their boundaries, testing the limits. And someone has to push back. Is that what I'm supposed to do? Push back?" Vernon set down his cup and turned to face me. For the first time since I had known him, I saw something like respect in his eyes. "That's what we all do," he said. "Every night, every shift, we push back against the darkness. Most people can't handle it. They break, or they run, or they make mistakes that get themselves killed. But you're different. You see what this place really is, and you're still standing here. That means something." I thought about the young man who had touched the trucker, about Martha who had opened a pantry door, about all the people who had come before me and failed. I thought about the weight of responsibility that came with knowing what I now knew. "I can't stay," I said finally. "Not forever. This place, it takes too much. I can feel it wearing me down." Vernon nodded slowly. "I know. It wears us all down eventually. But before you go, you need to understand something. The rules aren't just about survival. They're about respect. The things in this diner, the trucker, Eliza, the thing in the pantry, they're ancient. They were here long before us, and they'll be here long after. We don't fight them. We can't. All we can do is maintain the balance, keep the peace, and hope that someone else comes along to take our place when we're gone." I looked around the diner, at the faded booths and the cracked counter and the flickering neon sign outside. This place was a prison and a sanctuary, a nightmare and a calling. And I was one of its keepers, whether I wanted to be or not. "Find someone else," I said. "Train them like you train me. Make sure they understand." Vernon smiled. a rare expression that softened the lines of his weathered face. I was hoping you'd say that. I walked out of the Lonesome Star Diner as the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the empty parking lot. My car was waiting where I'd left it, and the highway stretched out before me, promising escape, promising normalcy, promising a life without scratching from locked pantries and truckers with impossible faces. But as I drove away, watching the diner shrink in my rearview mirror until it was nothing but a speck on the horizon, I knew that I would never truly escape. The rules had been burned into my soul, the horrors seared into my memory, and somewhere in the back of my mind, I could still hear the scratching. Soft, persistent, patient. I never went back to the Lonesome Star Diner. I found work in a city far from that stretch of Texas highway, surrounded by noise and light and the comforting presence of other human beings. I tried to forget what I had seen, what I had learned, what I had become during those weeks of darkness and terror. But some nights, when the world is quiet and the shadows seem to press just a little too close, I remember. I remember the trucker with his impossible eyes. I remember Eliza, sad and silent, waiting for her nightly offering. I remember the thing behind the pantry door, patient and hungry, whispering promises of freedom. And I remember the rules. Never look directly at the lone trucker. Always leave a slice of pie on table 7. And under no circumstances, acknowledge the scratching from the kitchen's locked pantry. Because some doors are meant to stay closed, and some secrets are meant to remain buried in the endless darkness of a Texas highway night. If you ever find yourself driving through that stretch of road, if you ever see the flickering neon sign of the Lonesome Star Diner, do yourself a favor. Keep driving. Don't stop. Don't even slow down. Because once you walk through those doors, once you become part of that world, there's no guarantee you'll ever walk out again. Some rules are made to be broken, but the rules of the Lonesome Star Diner are made to keep you alive. And trust me, you don't want to find out what happens when you forget that. The scratching never stops. The darkness never sleeps. And somewhere out there, on that lonely stretch of Texas highway, the diner waits. Patient, hungry, eternal, and it will be waiting long after we're all gone.